Have you ever been accused of operating by blind faith? Or maybe even somebody's accused you of expecting them to exercise blind faith whenever you're sharing your faith with them. Now, in fact, that's a misrepresentation. It's a false dichotomy of putting faith and evidence as opposites. The fact of the matter is that our faith in Jesus Christ need not be blind. Now, it can be. Some people do operate by blind faith. But for most of us, faith isn't blind. Most of us don't take a leap of faith, but rather we climb a staircase of faith, where our faith is a reasonable conclusion based on the available evidence that we have. So as we examine this concept of blind faith or reasonable faith, the leap of faith or the staircase of faith, we're going to take a very common example, and that's the Apostle Thomas in the Bible, Doubting Thomas as he's known. Now, some people feel that Thomas was treated unreasonably by Jesus, that he was being expected to believe in something as massive as the resurrection on no evidence at all. I mean, after all, believing that somebody's been raised from the dead is a pretty big ask, isn't it? But in fact, as we look closer at Thomas, we see that he had a mountain of evidence that he should have been able to base his faith on. The problem with that kind of thinking about Thomas, that this is an unreasonable request, is when we treat the Gospels as if they were a collection of unrelated incidents and stories. But there is a consistency, there's a coherence, there's a context. And when we look at Thomas and look at the context in which this encounter with Jesus happened, we see that he should have made a step of faith as a conclusion on the evidence that had already been presented to him. As one of the 12 apostles, Thomas had been an eyewitness to some incredible miracles, and he had seen people raised from the dead. In Luke chapter 7, he was with Jesus, and Luke mentions that the disciples were all with Jesus on this occasion. He was with Jesus when he entered a town called Nain and basically raised a widow's son to life again. And Thomas was there. Thomas saw that. And then in Matthew chapter 9, we read about where Jesus healed the daughter of a ruler in the synagogue, a guy named Jairus. And again, Matthew mentions that the apostles were there. Thomas saw this happen. And then, of course, there was the resurrection of Lazarus in John chapter 11. And John actually mentions, Thomas comes up in the whole narrative. Thomas is mentioned more in that narrative than any of the other 12 disciples. It's like John is laying a little hint for us there that Thomas knew that somebody could be raised from the dead because he had seen Lazarus raised from the dead after 4 days. Of course, Jesus himself predicted his own resurrection on many occasions, and particularly in John chapter 14. And again, John makes clear to us that Thomas was there because this happens in the context of a conversation where Thomas was asking Jesus questions about where he was going and what was happening. And Jesus effectively says this during that conversation. He says, "I'm telling you these things about my death and what comes after, so that when it happens, you will believe." And then, of course, there were the women who saw Jesus raised from the dead on that first Easter morning, chosen as good witnesses by God. I'm pretty confident they weren't the kind of people who would say, "Hey, we saw Jesus raised from the dead." Only kidding. No, these were powerful witnesses and truthful witnesses. And there's also the other disciples, the people who were on this journey of discipleship and faith with Thomas. Thomas wasn't with them when the other disciples actually saw Jesus raised from the dead on that first occasion, but he should have trusted their testimony because he knew them. C.S. Lewis, in his children's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, shares about these 4 siblings who are staying at the house of the professor. And the youngest child, Lucy, discovers this alternative world called Narnia. But when she comes back and tells her brothers and her sister about it, they refuse to believe her because they say it's totally illogical. And they go and tell this to the professor, and the professor says, well, why wouldn't you believe your sister? They said, because it's impossible, it defies logic. And the professor says, but have you found Lucy to be a trustworthy person in the past? And they say, yes. And he says, well, logic would actually lead you to believe what a trustworthy witness says if they've always been truthful in the past. And that's why the trustworthiness of a witness is so important. This is why commercial operations pay large sums of money to celebrities to endorse their products, because we feel we trust those people. This is why, for example, in a courtroom, a lawyer might try to destroy the character of a witness to portray them as being untrustworthy. Jesus wasn't asking Thomas to have blind faith. He was saying, Thomas, you've got an accumulation of evidence already, and you should have reached a conclusion of faith. You've got your own experiences, the evidence of the events that you saw. You've got the testimony of your fellow disciples. And you've got my predictions when I told you time and again what was going to happen. That's a mountain of evidence on which you to place your faith in the resurrection. So the problem wasn't that Thomas had no evidence. The problem was that he wouldn't believe the mountain of evidence that was in front of his eyes. And that's why instead of talking about blind faith, faith is a reasonable conclusion based on the available evidence. It's not a leap of faith. It's a staircase of faith where one step leads to another. Now look, evidence that leads to a conclusion is not absolute proof. In fact, it's doubtful whether we actually have absolute proof of anything except possibly in the field of mathematics. Many things that we accept as scientific facts are actually conclusions we've reached, not with absolute proof, but as the best conclusion that we reach through the evidence we have. I believe that certain things are true in the natural world, not because I've seen them with my own eyes, but because a witness that I trust, somebody like David Attenborough, tells me it to be so. And you know that I believe facts about history, about the life and death of Julius Caesar, based on what reliable historians report. And even when it comes to something as simple as cookery, based on my experiences of cooking things in the kitchen and tasting what I've cooked, I reach certain conclusions. I don't have absolute proof of any of this, but I do have soundly based conclusions on evidence that I've gathered. You know, the same is true of my faith in Christ. I came to Christ as an 18-year-old alcoholic. Probably the impetus for that happening initially was the testimony of others. There were other people in the same predicament as me, and they trusted their life to Christ, and their life changed. And I saw that, and I listened to their testimony, and I said, I'm going to give this a go. So you could call it an experiment, if you like. I reached out, I took a step of faith, and my life did change. Then I began to pray for things, and my prayers were answered. And that gave me more evidence to pray bigger prayers. I began to claim promises in the Bible. And, you know, the Bible does say, taste and see that the Lord is good. And on the basis of those experiences, I began to trust more of what the Bible said. And so I've reached the point where here I am now with quite an extensive Christian belief, but none of it has been blind faith. It's been a step-by-step reaching a conclusion and a set of conclusions based on the evidence that I have. Now look, none of this means that nobody can disagree with my conclusions, because we all take evidence, and sometimes we take the same pieces of evidence and we can reach radically different conclusions. And that's okay. That's why we're different. That's why we disagree. That's why we can discuss stuff. And it's certainly legitimate to discuss whether we as Christians have reached the correct conclusions on the evidence that we have. But let's do away with this nonsense of talking about blind faith. Reaching conclusions based on the limited evidence that you have is what we all do in every area of life. So just because we're using the same process in our Christianity, let's not start throwing nonsense around about blind faith. That's not helpful, and neither is it honest.